Excellent. Well, hello, everyone. In the interest of trying to understand how the brain works and processes information best, I will first apologize for my Canadian accent. It's very hard to get rid of. And second, I want everyone to take 15 seconds and move. 15 seconds, stand up for 15 seconds, and stretch. You're free for 15 seconds. 15 seconds exactly. 13. Brilliant. 2, 1, and okay. All right. Hopefully everyone can stay with me for another 10 minutes. My name is John Robertson, and I'm head of ESL and primary language coordinator, as was already mentioned, at Woodstock School, an international boarding school in the Himalayas, just north of here by a lot of hours driving. So, the title of my presentation, first, I've been teaching English for 12 years, but it's only in the last 2 years since joining Woodstock that I've started to realize how important primary languages are for basic cognitive proficiency. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is BICS, CALP, and the Role of English in Subject Learning Towards Biliterate Bilingualism. So BICS and CALP, many of you probably are not familiar with BICS and CALP, but BICS and CALP are two different ways of talking about the kind of language we use. There's the academic, which is CALP, and the communicative, which is BICS. And interestingly, those are both a big part of the GETS program that John talked about, and CLIL that Vijaya and John both talked about. So these are all quite connected. So, I would like to suggest first that in the role of English in language learning might be secondary. I think it is quite secondary. Subject learning in any language is key. The key is subject learning in the language you learn about the subject and the way you understand the subject, not necessarily English. English is important as an access language, and that's the purpose of English. So for English to have its greatest success, I believe the research does show us that it needs to be connected to knowledge already in the mind. Research suggests that the best way for language to be learned, in this case English, is that it's learned through what's already there. So I'll come to our first slide. I like to think of this as the mind, the outside knowledge that is met by our senses, drips down and slowly creates stalagmites. If you're familiar with stalagmites and stalactites. So, we never really know what exists in our students' brains. If we have many teachers here, we never know what exists in the brains of those we encounter and those we hope to educate. But it would do us well to try to find where that knowledge already is. There are many ways that this knowledge is formed in the brain. Some comes from society, some comes from our family, some from institutions. What matters is that this knowledge exists, and it existed before we met our students. As teachers, we try to find where that knowledge is and to set the new knowledge down on top of old knowledge. This can be quite hard. But when we fail to look for the stalagmites below us, for what our students already know, we not only waste time building on nothing, but what we're trying to build may well already be there. This is a problem that I think we face a lot in international schools, at least. So one knowledge that our students come to us with is their first language. And in general, for the vast majority of English speakers even, it is not their first language. A discussion on language learning in general, I think, always needs to include a first language. And it's something that is very often taken for granted, I think, at least in my experience. It's something that I only started learning about recently. So, whatever language already exists in the brain is very important for whatever new knowledge is going to come. Even the idea of bilingualism is actually now being questioned. That we have one mind. One mind draws on all the languages. But for the sake of argument today, we'll take a brief look at the history of bilingualism. The attitudes and understandings of bilingualism has certainly changed over history. Not even 100 years ago, Otto Jespersen wrote, "The child hardly learns either of the two languages as perfectly as he would have done if he had limited himself to one. Has any bilingual child ever developed into a great artist in speech, a poet, or an orator?" Yes, yes they have. Many, many have. Only 4 years later, there was a psychologist, very famous psychologist, Florence Goodenough, said, "The use of a foreign language in the home is one of the chief factors in producing mental retardation." Of course, neither of these are in any way remotely true. All the research that we've seen over the last 30 years has been incredibly, incredibly positive towards bilingualism. So, current views. Things have changed. Bilingualism has been shown to enable children to engage in wider communication across generations and cultural groups, foster a sympathetic understanding of difference in creed and culture, help students achieve biliteracy, that's being able to read and write fluently in two languages, increase classroom achievement, allow students to gain from cognitive benefits, raise self-esteem, establish a more secure identity, and even has been shown to be associated with economic advantages. Maurice Carter, in Bilingualism in International Schools, wrote that second language students have great potential for becoming fluent in the second language of the school to a literate level, overwhelmingly English in international schools, and I would say likely the same in India, and also for maintaining and developing literacy in their mother tongues. If we want our students to have great potential for becoming fluent in the second language of the school to a literate level, then we should probably focus on their first language as well. Drawing on 2 million student records, Thomas and Collier wrote, "We have concluded that first language cognitive and academic development is a key predictor of academic success in the second language." This means that the first language should definitely not be taken out. English should not replace anything, because if English tries to replace something, it's much more difficult for the brain to build English. So now we'll move on to BICS and CALP. In 1979, a man named Jim Cummins coined these terms, BICS and CALP, to differentiate between conversational language and academic language, CALP. These terms have since become part of the language that we use to talk about language acquisition in general. So here we see the common iceberg example. BICS is basic interpersonal communication skills. It's what you see at the surface. It's communication. It's acquired and used in high contact situations, activated and explained in scaffolded classroom instruction, face-to-face communication. Whenever you're talking to someone, there's always a context. There are facial expressions, gestures, everyday conversations. Things happen in a time and space and place, and you have context that you can understand that language through, and it's conversational. And it is, of course, above the surface. So this is BICS. CALP, and BICS takes, in a fully immersive environment, this level of language takes between 1 and 2 years. Okay, and this will become very important later on. So, remember that, 1 or 2 years for BICS. If we move forward, we look at CALP. It is below the surface. Of course, it is not what's obviously seen in a person. You never know what level of CALP someone has just by speaking to them. It is low context, it is abstract, and it is academic language. And this takes between 5 to 7 years to develop, 6 to 8 according to other research. This is a long time, and this much time to develop within the academic world of immersion. So, it's been shown that this develops most quickly when it is developed alongside the first language. The language is the difference between BICS and CALP has often been misunderstood, but in general we can see it as high context language versus low context language. When we integrate, for example, at Woodstock in international schools, when we integrate non-English speaking students into mainstream classrooms, we will start with gym and music, and then go on to science, and then social studies and English, and then philosophy and religious education. This is not according to difficulty of the subject at all, but it's according to context. So imagine in a gym class, you have a gym teacher, and the gym teacher says, okay everyone, I'm going to blow my whistle, and then you run. And then the language learner sees the gym teacher blow the whistle, and he sees all the other students run. Right, this is very low context, sorry, very high context language. Science often uses experiments, and so this is a very good way to see hands-on language, hands-on examples. Literature gets more abstract and dependent on reading ability, with the students having to read and understand by themselves and think critically. And philosophy and religious education require even more abstract thought, and the abstract language needed to talk about ideas. So of course, in speaking about second language acquisition, we are always talking about the first language as well. And if we look here at BICS and CALP in language 1, first language, and language 2, here in English, of course there's no brain like this. No two languages are exactly equal in someone's mind, but for the sake of thinking about this, let's imagine there's a person who has a first language and a second language, fully developed basic interpersonal communication skills, very fluent and communicative in both languages, and fully developed CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency, very, very developed, and a depth of language in two languages, a depth of abstract language. So, the common underlying proficiency between these, as you can see, is their access to CALP in both languages. Now, I can only speak to my own experiences in an international school, but I hope there'll be enough overlap for this to connect to some of you as well. I think that one of the biggest challenges we face is students who come learning a language and are immersed completely and develop BICS very quickly. So imagine a Korean student comes to my school, and in 2 years they sound intonationally and communicatively, they sound like all the other students. And then the teacher assigns a task and wonders why this student, why she can't do it as well as the other students. What's wrong with you? Why can't you understand this task? You sound like everyone else. Well, that's because the communication only takes 1 to 2 years, but the deeper language that we require for academic critical thinking, that takes 5 to 7. And that is not as easily seen. We judge people by the surface of the iceberg, but we don't judge them by what's beneath. So, if a second language is built upon the first language, this could have significant implications. If we imagine a student stops learning their primary language here, the second language will develop very quickly up until the point that they stop the first language, and after that point it becomes more difficult and more challenging. Whereas if a student develops the first language alongside the second language, both can develop together, both will develop more strongly, and both will support each other. So I realize that in the Indian context, languages are perhaps messier than anywhere else in the world. We have languages that aren't written. We have languages that are used only for business, languages that are used only with certain family members. The multilingual reality in India seems to have produced brains uniquely capable of rapid language learning. And I think this does give great potential for English acquisition as well and access to the broader world. But research and experience would caution us against allowing English to take on all the roles of subject learning and leaving the other important players out. Thank you very much.